good afternoon. My name is James Potts. I am the chair of the Young Fabians, but also a bit of a self-confessed transport nerd. I'm also an author and a writer in my spare time when I'm not in my day job, which is environment and planning policy for the Labour group at City Hall. So quite a few hats, and it's great to see such a great turnout today to this Fringe event looking at the transport agenda for the next Labour government. And we're joined by a fantastic panel of people here today. So first and foremost, we're going to start with Dhesi, who is the Labour MP for Slough. Was first elected in 2017, and you are the Shadow Rail Minister. So Tan, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. And it's a pleasure to be here as a Fabian member at the Fabian Society conference. Look, in terms of the 4 or 5 minutes that I've got, I will rattle off where I see the Labour Party's vision for transport. Look, in terms of my own portfolio, rail, the fragmented, privatised franchise model has failed us. It is not reliable, and the amount of cancellations, delays that passengers, the good people of Britain are experiencing, that's why we believe that the best way is to bring rail back into public ownership so that we as a party can establish the mechanisms whereby we have that punctuality, we have that reliability, and we have that guiding mind to deliver that superb public service that the public rightly expects. We also believe that we should be investing in the major infrastructure projects so that we deliver increased capacity on the system. That is very, very important when we talk about delivering Northern Powerhouse Rail. By the way, we've seen the transformative effect that the Elizabeth line has had, and that was a major transport investment into London and the South East. We believe that there needs to be a similar investment up north, whereby the Elizabeth line of the north, aka Northern Powerhouse Rail, needs to be delivered, HS2 needs to be delivered. Those sort of projects, they're not just about high speed, it's about increasing capacity. So that is why we are very, very firm in that belief. And we also feel that we need to increase the amount of freight that goes onto our rail. For each freight train, that takes off 76 HGV lorries. Now, that's where we believe that there should be an annual target. We also believe in order to decarbonise transport, there should be a rolling programme of electrification. We believe in devolution, whereby metro mayors and local authorities, that they can have the power to deliver public transport as per their needs, as per their demands. We also feel that the NSAR 2025, that we are missing the skills and recruitment agenda. We need to train more drivers. We need to ensure that we have more women, more young people interested in coming and working within the transport industry. We also believe in integration, so whether that's with the rail, with the buses, trams, and other forms of public transport. And in terms of buses, by the way, we feel that local authorities should have the power to take buses back into municipal control as and where they feel. I was in Birmingham recently with Liz, and that's the sort of power that we feel that local authorities, just as just down the road in Slough, Reading have done. Unfortunately, many other authorities have not been able to do so. We've had 19,000 rail services cut. We've had 5,000 bus services cut by this government. It is not just a managed decline, but as I said in the House just last week, that in effect in 2023, it seems like it is a free fall decline of our public transport. So that is why, under a Labour government, I'm very, very confident that we will be investing in our public transport, because we know that that matters immensely to everybody within our country. So those are, I think, just some of the key snippets of our policy. I was only given about 4 or 5 minutes as an intro, but I am more than happy hereafter to discuss during the Q&A and panel discussion towards the end. But thank you once again for inviting me.
No, that's great. Thank you, Tan. A really sort of great summary of sort of where some of the key issues are certainly facing the country. Next, we have Liz Clements, who's a councillor for Bourneville and Cottridge Ward in the city of Birmingham, which, being a Wolferidian from Wolverhampton, is not too far away. So you're also the cabinet member for transport on Birmingham City Council. So it's delighted that you could pop down the railway line and are here today. So over to you, Liz.
Thanks, James. And I just, hearing that from Tan, I mean, it's just made my day. I have to say, when Tan was in Birmingham, we had a meeting with colleagues in the Labour group, and then when we were trying to usher Tan out of the council house and down to New Street Station, he's a rock star. People were just queuing to have selfies and so on. So I'm absolutely delighted with what you've just said, because it's been a busy week in Birmingham. We've taken 3 decisions on expanding a low-traffic neighbourhood in Kings Heath and Moseley, and that was a difficult process, but we've held the line. We've also taken through a set of decisions about investing revenue from our Clean Air Charging Zone fund, and we're going to be investing in railway stations, hydrogen buses, safe routes for walking and cycling, active travel, because we are undertaking a transport revolution in Birmingham, and we have to hold the line on that. And I'm just desperate for there to be a Labour government, because we need that enabling policy framework. Unfortunately, I'm in my 50s, so I'm old enough to remember what it was like in 97. I remember John Prescott coming in with a really bold and visionary agenda about integrated transport. That actually inspired a lot of the officers who work for me now to get involved in the sector. But I'm afraid we didn't really deliver on those pledges. So it's great to have Tan and Lou in these portfolios to deliver on the pledges that we've made at conference. So we did talk about bringing back rail into public ownership as franchises expired, and giving councils the power to set up municipal bus companies, which you've just alluded to. So personally, I'm not that keen on taking over the Take Back Control slogan, but if we must do it, buses is the key area. For God's sake, give us the power to run the bus companies, specify the routes and the frequency, and start looking at the fares. Because buses in Birmingham, they are the mass transit network. They are the workhorses of the public transport network. That is how people, and particularly our voters, travel around Birmingham and the West Midlands. Again, and it's almost as though this is a setup on rail. The massive issue in the Midlands is capacity. So that's why we need the Midlands Rail Hub, which is to build the capacity around Birmingham New Street, which is a real bottleneck in the national rail system. We need HS2. And for me as a Birmingham politician, the issue about HS2 is genuinely about capacity and freeing up the regional and local services around the West Midlands conurbation, and that's what we need to move forward on. We should also be electrifying railway, because that's how to start tackling carbon emissions and decarbonising rail. We've been asked to talk about some what we can learn from European countries here at this conference. And I'm a linguist by background. I've spent a lot of time in Germany. I'm also a transport nerd. So in the summer, I was in Germany travelling around with my €9 ticket. So I want to see some innovative thinking on cheaper flat rate fares. And we just generally need to learn from Germany, Spain, and as we heard this morning, from Portugal. And cheap travel on public transport is a response to the cost of living crisis and the climate emergency. It's a no-brainer in my view, and we've had money for all sorts of things particularly over the pandemic, and we need to start looking at how we provide some subsidy for those sort of flat fares. Active travel, I want an incoming Labour government to have a firm commitment to walking and cycling as a first choice, particularly in conurbations, and I want you to be judging councils by their ambitions and their commitment to things like bus priority. This may sound like boring, prosaic stuff, but it is actually the meat and drink of transforming transport in our cities. And it was interesting, I've just been in the environment panel, and we talked about the language on particularly car use, and I think we need to avoid getting into a toxic culture war where we attack people for using cars. We need to turn it around and look at what is appropriate car use, particularly in built-up areas. The car's a useful tool, just like a bike is a useful tool, and we need to start giving people good options so that they actually don't need to get their car out in Birmingham to drive down the road to do some shopping or take their children to school. And once you provide good options and once it's safe to walk and cycle, you get out of these really difficult and sometimes quite abusive arguments that we've got into in Birmingham around this low traffic neighbourhood in Moseley and Kings Heath. So I want us to try and exercise some leadership on that while taking people with us. So really, I just want to follow up, finish up by saying we've already got the tools in our hands to rise to the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis, and those are walking, cycling and public transport. Let's get on with it.
That's great news. Thank you very much. And I think it's really important, obviously, you sort of touched on it there, about the fact that, it's 2 birds with 1 stone, effectively. The climate crisis, can also be tackled by a lot of these issues in terms of modal shift as well. So, yeah, I absolutely agree on those points as well. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Seb Dance, who is a former MEP for London, but in your current role, you are the Deputy Mayor for Transport at London City Hall. So we do occasionally see each other around the building, which is quite nice. So, Seb, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think we're at risk of being in violent agreement on quite a lot of things.
No violence.
Well, yeah,
Yes,
that's
definitely no
vehement agreement.
Yeah, vehement.
So, look, in London, we've identified three key challenges that we have to tackle. The first is congestion, which is something that is costing businesses and residents huge amounts every single day. The second is the toxic air that we're breathing day in, day out, caused by a number of different factors, but of course transport is the key contributor to some very nasty particulate matter and key toxic emissions that are out there. And the third, of course, is the climate emergency, which is fast becoming increasingly recognised as the single biggest threat to our quality of life going forward. I have to say that it's not just the same three challenges that we see in cities around the UK, it's the same three challenges we see in cities around the world. I have spoken to a number of, I suppose there should be a collective noun for deputy mayors for transport, but I leave that out to a competition and probably not for today. But we meet regularly, actually, both virtually and in person, and we're constantly swapping ideas and the kind of challenges that we're facing. And the similarity is extraordinary. It is no exaggeration to say that the challenges, the policy mix that people are facing in different cities around the world when it comes to transport is fairly identical. We've seen a huge increase in the sort of big projects that London's able to deliver. The Elizabeth line is, I think, probably the most totemic example. But of course, these were all born in an era where money was relatively available compared to what it is now. And some of the big schemes that were envisaged have been in the pipeline for a very, very long time. And they are all designed to contribute to our overall target of having 80% of all journeys in London undertaken by public and active transport by 2041. That is our overriding objective. But of course, the key difference that we face with other parts of the world is a funding question. And the situation that we find ourselves in now is very different to the situation in which those big infrastructure projects, such as the Elizabeth line, the Barking Riverside extension to the London Overground, Bakerloo extension, Crossrail 2, all of these infrastructure projects that were talked about, two of which have been delivered, two of which have not, and have been in discussion for quite some time. We're now in a very different era. We at TfL are dependent two-thirds, 73%, so some three-quarters, dependent on fare revenue as our funding model. This is a model that was put in place by the former mayor alongside former, we have to count a long way back, Chancellor of the Exchequer, which removed the operating grant that TfL received. When you compare that to other parts of the world, thinking in particularly of some cities that have been lauded as examples of free market utopias, such as Singapore, the reverse is true. They are three-quarters dependent on tax revenue from municipal government to support their transport system. So we are running a system based on the collection of fares as the primary, and in some cases only, way in which to support services. We've seen the problems with that model when you have something as severe as a pandemic that we've just lived through, when 95% of ridership during the peak of the pandemic, ridership fell by 95%, and of course the corresponding decline in TfL's revenue means that we're in a very, very different era. So the kinds of projects that we have to look at, in addition, of course, to making the case for publicly funded investment in public transport, which ultimately is where we need to go, has to be combined, I think, with a complete change in mindset when it comes to what it means to live in a free society, what it means to live in a congested environment where we have competing demands. I'm struck by the fact that we're meeting on the Euston Road, which is the world's first bypass. It was built in the 1700s as a way of driving cattle from one part of London to the city without going through the congested city streets, and it was built through open fields. And of course, over the years, the Euston Road, it was originally called the New Road, the Euston Road became more and more congested, first with horses and carts and then with vehicle traffic. And of course, it was 160 years ago that they invented a solution to this, which was to put mass transit underneath the road and transport people underground in underground trains. And we have gone full cycle from the investment in mass transit all the way through to the car-led culture that we've seen dominate through the latter half of the 20th century, this idea that we would all have 2, 3, even 4 cars per household, and that the roads would be ever, widened again and again and again in order to put more and more space of the public realm over to the car. And this was seen as the way in which we would progress through to the future. And of course, we've come full circle. We've realized the catastrophe, actually, that has meant for our urban environment, the catastrophe that it's meant for the environment. And this is quite right. The car is a fundamental part of the mix, but it can't be the principal way in which we get around our cities. It doesn't work. In a city of 9 million, in a city of 1 million, it doesn't work. There's not enough space. So actually we have to return to some of the solutions of the past. The underground is the example I give, but so too is the bicycle. These are solutions that are actually really effective ways of getting people around. And what happens when you remove unnecessary car journeys is you free up the roads for necessary car journeys. And that is something that motorists, as well as cyclists and pedestrians and public transport users, can all get behind. But this is the plea. We need investment, and that investment has to come from central government.
That's great. Thank you, Seb.
Well said.
Yeah, really well said on a lot of points there. That's great. Now, final speaker, unless we have Neil online, which I think we may do, but I will come next to Jen Thornton, who is the Campaigns and Communications Advisor at ASLEF, and you previously worked for Joe Stevens MP, I believe. So, but your current role, yes. So, Jen, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, as Seb said, I think we're going to have quite a lot of agreement from this stage, but that feels really encouraging to me because it's about time we had some and actually went forward and started winning and doing things with it. So there are two very obvious crises facing the world at the moment, the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis. Transport has a role to play in solving both of those, really obviously. So I've got 3 things that I think we can learn from other countries and do and make sure are in Labour's plans going forward. Public ownership, thinking of transport as an important service, building great infrastructure, and reducing costs and increasing wages to tackle the cost of living. So in terms of owning public, other countries in Europe own and operate their railway publicly. They also own some bits of our railway. It's quite clearly a good idea for governments to own their own transit. Nobody would say things like we subsidise the NHS or we subsidise schools. We fund the NHS and we fund schools. Rail transport is a public service and it's something that we should fund. It shouldn't be considered a subsidy. Profit should not be leaking out of it. A couple of the most egregious things that happen on the railway are the bits that you don't see. So we all know about the branding of Avanti and whoever who are in the news for taking profit out. There's also these companies called rolling stock companies, Roscoe's. They actually own the trains. They own the trains because we, the taxpayer, made the trains and then gave them to these companies for free at privatisation. They are now leasing those trains back to the train companies and the taxpayer is subsidising the profit for that to happen. So just on really basic stuff like that, that is what the next Labour government, and I know Tan wants to do that, is start bringing that sort of stuff back into the public. We should absolutely be owning our own trains and running them in a way that works for the public, not for profit to leak out. Second, building good infrastructure. I think we've all said again, the UK is so far behind our European neighbours on things like high-speed rail and electrification. We are still not even at 40% of electrified railway. Trains are better for the environment than cars and motor vehicles, but electrified trains clearly far better. Climate emergency requires that to happen, and particularly things like freight to go on rail, as Tam was saying, which is fantastic. What the Tory governments of the last 13 years have done is, I've written in my notes here, half-arsing of projects, which is where they've sort of said they're going to do an infrastructure thing, they've said we're going to electrify this, and they've got halfway, often because they start in London, which they should have started at the other end. Yeah. So they start in London, go halfway, and then think, nah, well, it's all right, never mind. No one will notice if we don't get from Cardiff to Swansea, because we've got to Reading, and that's all anybody's bothered about. And the integrated rail plan for the North and the Midlands looked on the face of it like this incredible thing. It was going to reduce journey times, all this infrastructure was going to be built. But when you actually read it, there was a huge amount of language for some of the sort of second stage projects that read to me an awful lot like, it's not really going to happen, but we've put it in so we can do the bits that we want to do. And they're also, so on HS2, as we know, the route has been cut short. We can't do things like France has done, banning internal flights for quick rail journeys unless we can actually make quick rail journeys. So we have to complete HS2 right the way, right up to Scotland. We've got to get that infrastructure. And we've got to stop doing things like the government's doing in Manchester, where they're insisting on putting a station above ground in the middle of the city, which will make it hard to then bolt on a future railway line when it clearly needs to go underground. Cost more, but actually for the future, for the climate and for the people of Manchester, far better solution. So proper infrastructure investment. And then tackling the cost of living crisis. So the European countries all over the place, we talked about Germany's €9 ticket. In Spain, they've got 100% discount currently on what they call multiple tickets, I think, so sort of season tickets and multi-use tickets. And various other European countries are doing this because they know that they need people out of their cars and onto rail and onto public transport. We are subsidising because the way the fares are now paid, another thing that the government has hidden quite well during the pandemic. It used to be a franchise model. You paid your fare to Avanti got your money. They were incentivised to run a good service based on the franchise they'd been handed out by government. During the pandemic, the government changed this so that all of the risk is now on the public purse, but the profit remains in the private sector. So when you are paying your fare box, that is going to government, and they are handing a set fee to that rail company. They say it depends how well they run it, whether they get all their money. But Avanti just got a bonus, and anyone who's been on an Avanti train will know that they should not have had a reliability bonus for how the trains run. So we are currently taking all of that risk. Obviously, I work for a trade union, so the other element of the cost of living crisis, which cuts right across society, is the wage spiral. We are not paying people across the economy the wages they should be paid. The rail company is obviously currently in a dispute because the government is trying to withhold pay rises from people who've had a freeze for years. That's not sustainable. It does need to be resolved. And the better we fund it and sort of take this private profit and subsidy out of the model of how we operate the railways, the more that we can actually get people's wages right and make it a great place to work, and prioritising having enough staff to keep things safe, because that's a far higher priority, or it certainly should be, than making profit. So yeah, that's the three things that I think we should learn and take forward: public ownership, building great infrastructure, and tackling the cost of living. Thank you.
That's great, thank you, Jen. I believe we have our next speaker online, who is Neil Bibby MSP, who is a regional MSP up in Scotland and is the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Transport for the Labour Party up there. So Neil, I think you're behind me, so yep, over to you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Apologies for being slightly late, and I missed Tan's contribution. I can't unfortunately blame the traffic on that one. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I couldn't get a train. And we don't all have private jets that can get us up and down the country very quickly. I did look at taking the car as well, but somebody told me I would have to wear a seatbelt for 8 hours. Who knew? Who knew? Thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this discussion alongside Tan, Liz, Seb and Jen, and I agree with an awful lot of what each of them has said to talk about the ambitions for us on the left. And this is a policy that runs through so many different other areas in so many different ways. Of course, in a post-pandemic world, we need to get our country moving again. We need to get our economy moving again, and our public transport system is so critical to literally getting the country and the economy moving as well. But in so many other ways, in terms of creating a fairer society, a healthier society, a wealthier society, and a greener society, it's vital that we have a public transport system that helps people get on and get by. And that's why, I would agree very much what Jen said about public transport being a public service that meets the needs of the travelling public. And to achieve those aims, I think there are 3 pillars that need to underpin our approach and have underpinned our approach in Scotland. Affordability: are the travelling public getting a fair deal? Accessibility: are people getting a service where they need it and when they need it? And reliability: is the bus going to turn up on time? And are ferries going to turn up at all if you're living in islands on the west coast of Scotland? Sadly, in Scotland, we are falling well short of those objectives, and we're reminded on a daily basis of the importance of a joined-up vision for public transport. Over the last decade, devolution has presented an opportunity for us to do things differently and depart from the discredited policies of the Tories at Westminster. And to a large extent in Scotland, we have done that and done things differently, but unfortunately not always have we done them better, and important lessons that we can learn from that. Take buses, for example. Nicola Sturgeon boasts for the most generous concessionary travel scheme in the UK, and she's correct. Not only do people over 60 get a free bus pass, now young people 21 and under do also. We supported this, and it does provide many great benefits. But the flip side of that is it's now not just older people who are asking, what's the point in a free bus pass if you can't get a bus? But it's also the burden of that policy is falling on the rest of the population. And workers and families in Scotland today are paying the highest bus fares in the UK. So while we've seen action from Labour mayors in Manchester, Liverpool and West Yorkshire to take buses into public control and cap bus fares, and I appreciate there's a long way to go in other areas of England. Most Scots, unless you live in Edinburgh and you have the council-run Lothian buses, which are excellent, most Scots are still at the mercy of a broken, unregulated private market providing unreliable services and rip-off fares. And it's a similar story when it comes to our trains as well. Although ScotRail has entered public ownership, that was after years of pressure from Scottish Labour and trade unions like ASLEF. The SNP did accept the case for taking ScotRail back into public ownership. They could possibly not after the shambolic Abellio deal. But then they sat back as if it's job done. We've taken it into public ownership, now job's done. Instead of realising the opportunity of public ownership to create a proper people's railway, it has been undermined by permanent cuts of 10% to timetable services. And I very much agree with what Seb said there about funding and the funding of services. This is what we're seeing in Scotland is a consequence, unfortunately, of the SNP's lack of vision for Scotland. We see time and time again, you've probably seen it yourself, the SNP have great election slogans during campaigns, but what they don't have is a plan for delivery on the ground in Scotland, and we don't have a transport network in Scotland that we can be proud of, can have confidence in, or frankly many Scots can afford. So therefore there is an opportunity for Scottish Labour to build its vision for a more inclusive transport system underpinned by the three pillars I mentioned earlier. And I believe there's also much Labour can help learn from other transport networks, whether it be the €9 ticket in Germany that Liz and others have mentioned, which simplified a complex system and boost passenger numbers. We've also called for the Scottish Government to halve ScotRail fares for 3 months to try and boost passenger numbers. But unfortunately, despite Nicola Sturgeon's bold claims, Scotland's not yet that progressive beacon for transport, which Labour can look to. Our challenge, I think, is to avoid the mistakes of the SNP and create a vision for transport which delivers our ambitions for the country and for everyone who lives here. Thank you.
That's great, Neil. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you for that to all of our panellists. I mean, you may also see that Roy is up there, who sadly can't be with us today because there is a train issue in Sussex where he lives. So sadly he can't be here to join us either, but I'm very grateful to everybody for their comments so far. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, so I'm going to take them in rounds of 3, and I will be looking for agenda balance as well. So I'm going to pick the lady here on the front row in the black. Holly. And then, so Leon's just come with a microphone. Then I'm going to pick the lady on the 3rd row just there second, and then the gentleman behind that lady in the sort of grey jacket afterwards.
Thank you. I don't have a particularly challenging question because I think, like you all, and like most of the room, we're all violently agreeing with you on everything you've said. I wanted to ask, which one transport policy do you think is the most vital, the priority above all, for the next Labour government to deliver?
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you very much. Councillor Jill Sargent from Barnet, who has just become Labour for the first time. So,
well done, Barnet Labour.
Sitting here with one of my CLPs, so we're very excited, full of ideas. One of the things, though, and thank you everybody for all your contributions, is that I'm very concerned about the people who can't access transport because of disabilities, because of age, and who are imprisoned in their own homes. And I think this is going to be a real challenge for the future, is how to be able to get them to access any sort of transport that's affordable.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman just behind.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Isaac from DLD Partnerships. And first of all, thank you for the wonderful panel. And I'm very glad that ideas coming up to learn from our European neighbours and how they do transport in their respective countries. But I do wonder, is it also time to look further into Asia Pacific, into countries like Taiwan, Japan, Korea, even China, into how they have structured their transport system and how they are able to build modern systems that are affordable in both cities and rural areas. I think there are a lot of stuff we could learn from there, potentially, if Labour wants to get into government.
No, thank you for that. It's a really good point. So how many kilometres of high-speed rail have China built? But then their system is completely different to ours. But yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, like they are, different forms of governments. But
yes.
Yeah.
It's a different system. Yes, but you make a really good point about the international stuff as well. So. Yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you very much for those. We're going to come back to Tan first, and then we'll sort of maybe go in a different order. But yeah, Tan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, look, just rattling off those questions very quickly. Priority for a Labour government, I think, is to have a government that is serious about public transport, about investing in it. So, like I said, bringing rail back into public ownership, that's the way that we then drive also a rolling program of electrification to decarbonize. All of those things are extremely important in terms of buses, giving local authorities the freedom so that they can then invest in their hopefully municipal buses. As well as in terms of active travel, if we give the funding to the various authorities, and they can invest in cycle lanes, in active travel within their own areas. I mean, Seb was explaining earlier, we've constantly got Tories in the chamber having a go at the Mayor of London without actually giving him the requisite funding, without giving the resources. So that's where the key is to invest in public transport. So a government which focuses in on that. Accessibility, I think absolutely correct, and that's why we've got to have targets to make sure that we make more of our stations accessible as quickly as possible in terms of level boarding, in terms of various other initiatives, so that we can have that accessible system throughout, in terms of trains, in terms of buses, etc. Isaac, again, there's a lot of agreement in this room. Yeah, normally I'm always up for a bit of a ding dong, whether it's in the chamber or elsewhere. But I think, look, given the dire straits that we find our transport system in, I think that's why there is a lot of agreement. But yeah, again, you're right that we need to learn the lessons, not just from our European neighbours, but from best practice around the world. In terms of their timetabling, in terms of punctuality. We've seen some of the amazing feats within Japan, South Korea. You mentioned about the high speed in China, etc. So we know certain things can work, but we just need to draw upon those best practices and ultimately arrive at a situation in a few years' time whereby others look to us, that they look to our expertise, that we are investing in R&D to then export that expertise into other parts of the world.
Thank you, Tan. I think there was a point, wasn't there, about in Japan, the train company apologised because the train was seconds late. I think it's something like 15 seconds late. That's how good their punctuality is. Imagine if we had that in the UK. I'm going to come to Jen next, if that's all right.
So which one policy? Tan went for an extremely broad one. I'm going to, controversially for someone from a rail union, go with buses. They are, for people outside London and some other cities, buses are so important, and it's really important that they can be run for people's need as a service rather than for profit making. It is essential. I think also that does go to your question about people being able to access and get out of their homes. If we're running buses where people live, from where people live to where they need to go, then that just leaps forward in terms of access just from a starting point. That's where the frequent services should be. I think the other thing about access is there's a lot around staffing. Sorry, we're in London. There's a lot around staffing on the railway. I get criticised for this in work. The part of the RMT's dispute, I will not try and speak for the RMT, I don't work for them, I'm not a member, but part of their dispute is about the levels of staffing, particularly on the railway. For people who have access needs, other needs aren't as familiar, having people there to help is so vital in accessing the railway and accessing even a bus station, having somebody to advise and make sure that people are safe and can get on and off services. So I think making sure that we do have a safe, fully staffed network as well.
That's great, thank you, Jen. We'll come to Neil next.
Thanks, James. I think the most important thing for a future Labour government to do is to run public transport to a different set of values. We've seen under the Conservatives, a contraction in the level of public transport, and I think if we run to a different set of values, Labour values about supporting people to get on and to get by, to ensuring people can access the public transport system, that it's more affordable, I think we'll see different outcomes. There is a lot of investment going in. Do we often get the return for that investment? No. If we leave it to just the private companies to extract all the profit, but we do need to see more investment as well. Accessibility is absolutely crucial. We do need to see more done to enable everyone to access public transport, but specifically adaptations for stations, etc. I would agree with Tam on that in terms of railway stations. And of course, I think we do need to look at other examples. I'm particularly interested in how do we really balance the relationship between our towns and our cities in Scotland, and ensure that people can access their towns and support their local communities as well, and not only, I think, have a public transport system with active travel that makes people healthier, but leads to local communities being wealthier as well. So I think we need to look at how we can those examples that were mentioned before.
Okay, thank you, Neil. And Liz?
Thanks very much. I'm going to cheat a bit. I've got on the top priorities. I've got two. I agree with Jen on buses. We need to run the buses in the public sector, and they need to be run as a public service to serve passengers going where passengers want, frequently and cheaply. It's absolutely the top priority, and you're so right about the importance of buses in the rest of England. But the other thing I'd like to say is I'd like to see that every child in a primary school learning to ride a bike or having the opportunity to do a bikeability course, because that's how you actually start that change in attitudes about mobility. Because I think several people have said it, we are literally running out of space in built-up areas for cars. On disabled access, the colleague from Barnet, I think that's such an important issue, and I think as councils we need to start being sort of throwing our weight a bit more on this. So buses, we need to look at the accessibility standards of the fleet and actually start talking to operators, because we have got things like partnership arrangements already on buses. And in Birmingham, Midland Mencap has been doing some research and looking at how you can get onto a bus with different sorts of mobility aids, mobility scooters and other kinds of adapted bicycles and so on. And I think you need to start getting down to the nitty-gritty of it. Obviously, there's also things like transport on demand, which is something that the Transport for the West Midlands is investing quite a lot of money in. So that's where you can actually have a personalised transport service. And there's more traditional things like ring and ride, because like you, I'm really concerned about disabled people and them feeling that they actually haven't got access to mainstream buses and trains. And so again, it grieves me in the West Midlands that we've got the franchisee holder West Midlands Trains. They are behind their target for bringing in new rolling stock, and I've discovered recently that the rolling stock will still have a high step to get into the carriages. And I actually came from Essex, where I grew up this morning, because I went to stay with my family. And on Greater Anglia, there's new rolling stock, and it's level boarding. And if you go on the tube, it's level boarding. And that's the standard of access that we need everywhere. So, and that's a major investment challenge. And then on the gentleman's question about learning from examples in China, East Asia, I just think we need to learn from anywhere where there's a model that works. Because I think once you start travelling, then you just realise how inferior our public transport is, unless you're in bits of London. I grew up in Essex, so I'm familiar with what's on offer in London and in bits of the commuter part of the south. But once you start to get in other parts of the country, you're lucky to get a bus once a day, or any train service. So I just think we need to be quite humble about this. We have decades and decades of progress to make up here. We've got a massive funding challenge, as Seb's outlined, but we need to start, if we're going to talk about levelling up, let's level up to the best in public transport and actually make that mean something.
That's great. Thank you, Liz. And Seb, finally.
Yeah, thank you. So, Isaac, your point about international comparisons is really important. And actually, I think it plays to some of the history of the car revolution and the mistakes that have been made in many parts of the world. And we talk primarily about North America as an example of what not to do in many cases. And, you know, as countries go through various stages of economic development, they either learn the mistake or they avoid the mistake, and we're seeing in many cases the mistake being avoided. I mean, it's unthinkable now that you would plan a new urban environment without putting the requisite public transport options in. Even as recently as 10 years ago, that might not necessarily have been the case. The car might have been the predominant form of travel in that planning environment. So I think there's an awful lot we can learn. I'm going to be slightly controversial, though, and say there's actually quite a few advantages we have in this country compared to the rest of the world. In terms of the density of the rail network, even post-beaching, we have some real opportunities if we put that investment in and have that vision there. So we shouldn't entirely discount what happens here. And actually, when you look at some of the innovation we have, and of course I've got my London hat on here, but the technology that we've put in on ticketing, on some of the data use that we have at TfL is really cutting edge. And I think there's an awful lot that we can work with partners around the world to teach them on what we're doing to improve things. Our colleague from Barnet Labour, I mean, accessibility is absolutely essential. There's no point having a public transport system if it's not public. And you know, we're doing a lot on step-free access, on expanding things like the dial-a-ride scheme and ensuring that that last mile there are options there, but obviously we need to do far more. And actually a lot of accessibility isn't just about big ticket items like step-free, it's about educating staff on how to deal with passengers, how to recognize the difficulties that different people have, whether that be age-related or cognitive related or any other form of disability. There's many forms of disability that aren't visible that need to be taken account of on the network, and some of that requires some innovative thinking on how we adapt a legacy network, and of course when we plan new routes, how we build that in. On the Holly, your question on the one transport priority, you know, there's a myth that the car is cost-free and that, you know, the individual takes care of the car, therefore it's not a concern for government, and that public transport isn't profitable. That is a myth. Public transport is profitable because if you take away the running costs, the money in, the money out, and you look at the value to the city or the wider region of having a public transport system, it is immensely profitable. The cost of switching off the network to businesses in terms of increased congestion, in terms of people unable to get to their place of work to visit family and friends, unable to go to the theatre or restaurants or all of the other things that contribute to economic growth is enormous. We know, for example, that the 19 billion, it's a lot, that the Elizabeth line cost, the 19 billion that it costs generates 42 billion to the national economy every single year. So the public transport network is profitable. So what I would like as a single policy is to redress the situation we have now, which is that through our taxation system, we're all paying for the upkeep of the roads, the pothole repairs, the wear and tear that increasingly heavy and big vehicles cause on our public streets. And it's the public transport user who's subsidising the car user. It needs to be the other way around.
That's great. Thank you, Seb. We've got 20 minutes, so we have time for some more questions. I'm going to take the gentleman who is in the white shirt and the red tie just at the back, and then I'm going to take, who else have we got? The lady here in the black and white top at the front, Geraldine, and then the gentleman at the front. And then we'll have time probably for one more after that, so we've still got 20 minutes at the minute. But yeah, short answers and questions and answers, that obviously means more people can get in, so yeah.
Hi, Graham Hughes from Labour Social here. I'd like to ask a question about Northern Powerhouse and what's going to happen with that under Labour. But since Seb is here, I can't afford to get the train to London because there's £150 return at the moment. So I take the bus. Our bus station here in London is from the 1930s and it's right in the middle of London. So you have these diesel buses coming from not just all over the country, but from all over the continent into the middle of a low emissions area. It's absolute madness. If you want to take best practice from other countries, they have a northern bus station, an eastern bus station, a western bus station, where you come in and you can use your ticket to then get on the integrated transport in that city. Why can't we have that here? That's to Seb mostly, but if anyone wants to answer that, that'd be great.
No, thank you. You don't. Not all panelists maybe answer all the questions, but no, Geraldine just here, and then.
I'll stand up because I'm short.
That's okay. Yeah.
Because I'm short. I can't drive. Actually, no one in my family can drive. I've gone on holiday in the UK. Okay? I've had little weekends. I often find this catch-22 in lots of areas. No one drives, especially Wolverhampton, which is where my dad's family's from. Everyone drives because public transport's bad, and public transport's bad because everyone bloody drives. Also, another point, I use buses to get to work, the W15 especially. That often actually has to end early because there isn't another bus driver to take over that route. And night buses are, my local night bus is once every half hour. For half hour. So when I finish on a Friday night after work, because I work at a bar, I usually have to walk home. It's about 10-15 minute walk. And I don't really want to because I'm tired, I'm sore, and I'm doing me in a bad mood because I've had a pub for idiotic customers.
Yeah. Thank you, Geraldine. It's a good point now about sort of nighttime transport as well. And I know we have a network of night buses and night tube in London, but nowhere else. But that's a good point. Maybe that's something that, again, to be a priority going forward. And then gentleman in the front,
I agree with everything, but there's one thing that I do think you've all missed. It's disappointing it's not been mentioned, which is road safety. This is a hugely good story for Labour. If you take the first decade of this century, under Labour government, road deaths and serious injuries halved. Since 2010, they've flatlined, absolutely flatlined. Every year, we have 28,000 deaths and serious injuries. That's the size of a medium-sized town, either being killed or having life-threatening change. Huge burden on our health system, on our rescue services, policing, etc., and all the human misery. It's rare you can identify a policy and say Tory policy kills. This is the one where you can prove it. The Tories have suppressed this subject. There was a target under Labour government to cut road deaths by 50%, more or less met it. As soon as 2010 came in, they abolished the target. And that actually had a big effect on local authorities. They transferred responsibility for road safety to local authorities and then cut the budget, right? The other thing they've done is they've suppressed it as a parliamentary role. There used to be a whole tradition of very distinguished Labour, Jim Fitzpatrick, Lord Larry Whitty, etc. They were road safety ministers. We do not have a road safety minister. It's suppressed within the title of roads. This whole subject is being overlooked. I'm afraid also in Parliament. This subject's barely raised at ministerial question time. There hasn't been any debate really until very recently. Actually, the best thing that happened recently was Sunak not wearing a seatbelt. Barbara Castle introduced the seatbelt. Yep. Barry Shearman, Labour MP, led making seatbelt wearing. The front bench, Labour needs to re-own an issue which we won on and which kills people under the Tories. Thank you.
No, thank you. Good points made. I'm going to come to Seb in the first instance. I feel like two of those questions are very London heavy, and then I think on road safety then, I think if we then sort of open it up, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for your question, David. I mean, as you'll know, we haven't abolished the target in London at all. In fact, we have a target of zero. Vision Zero is one of the Mayor's flagship policies on this, and that essentially means that we have a target of zero deaths and injuries on our road. Now, a lot of people say, that's completely unrealistic. Well, actually, it puts us on a trajectory, and B, there are examples in other parts of the world where they have done this. Oslo is a good example where I can't remember the year, but they had zero road deaths on one of their reported years. So it is possible to do this. There's a whole range of things that we need to do, of course. Direct vision standards for trucks that operate in London. We have a specific requirement on heavy goods vehicles that they have the latest standards on vision to ensure that the driver has as close to 360 vision as is currently possible using technology available. That's something that other European countries in particular are now copying and looking at. So it's another example of where we can provide leadership and show what is possible. Across London, working with boroughs as well, and we haven't also touched on governance, by the way, in terms of the difficulties we have at a local government level, but working with the boroughs and on the TfL roads network, we're increasing the prevalence of 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. which has been proven not to significantly lengthen the journey undertaken by either cars or buses, but has an enormous impact on the road fatality and injury statistics, where being hit by a vehicle at 20 miles an hour is significantly, you are significantly more likely to survive such an impact than at 30 miles an hour. Geraldine, you spoke brilliantly about the basic spiral of lack of confidence in transport options. If you have a service that is reduced from 15 minutes to every 30 minutes, people stop using it. And if people stop using it, the government looks and says, well, we're going to stop funding it. And then it's a total spiral of disuse. And we're seeing that, I should say, in some of the train operating companies that aren't managed by TfL, where some of the service reductions have been very notable coming in and out of mainline stations in London. And that has a correspondingly depressing impact on the numbers of people that are travelling on trains as opposed to other forms of transport. We have seen a significant bounce back in the use of the car since the pandemic, and we have to avoid a car-led recovery if we're going to make a success of this. So it's important that we don't lose sight of the importance of a regular train, bus, tube, and any tram service that people can rely on and know in confidence that they won't be waiting too long to use that service. It's a hugely important part of the mix. Greg, it's a great question. Victoria Coach Station is beautiful, by the way. The Art Deco design, I think, is something. But that's a personal thing rather than a comment on the service available at Victoria Coach Station. I should say that the coaches themselves aren't something that we directly regulate. We'd have to work with DFT in order to change the vehicle emission standards that would apply to coaches coming in and out of the capital and that travel around the country. Of course, they would have to be ULEZ compliant in order to avoid paying a ULEZ charge, but that obviously doesn't mean that coach operators wouldn't pay that. So we can do things and are doing things in terms of air quality, but again, we have to work with national government to ensure that we decarbonise our entire fleet, including, of course, the national and international coach network and systems. In terms of your suggestion on northwest, east-west, north-south, east-west, I'll of course look at that, but there are of course other advantages in having a single hub for travel in that Victoria is extremely well connected, but of course Crossrail 2 would make it even more well connected.
Thank you, Seb. Anybody else want to come back on any of those questions in particular? Yeah, Liz and then Tan.
Really good question about road safety, and I think there's just the constraints of time, because I think everywhere is trying to work, where councils are trying to work towards Vision Zero, and it's true that we now have virtually no budget for road safety, which is a disgrace. So we also don't have any budget for speed cameras, which was cut by the Tories in 2012. All we have is average speed cameras. And I was just looking at my notes, other things that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but there's on air quality, what I'd like to see is a Labour government coming in and legislating for much more stringent targets, adopting World Health Organisation targets, because that's very much in our mind in Birmingham. We've got a charging clean air zone, and that's really about addressing a public health emergency. And the other things now I'm here, we need legislation to ban pavement parking outside Greater London, because that is the most frequent thing that anyone who's a local councillor here, anywhere, gets complaint. You're just inundated with complaints about that all the time. And in outside London, it is very, very difficult to get anything done about it. And then the other thing is I'm on a trip about is regulation of e-scooters. So those are some of my top issues.
Thank you, Liz. Tan?
Yeah, thank you very much. In terms of the first question, I know you wanted to ask about Northern Powerhouse Rail. Rest assured, it's not just me, but Keir, Angela, Rachel, Lou, many others have spoken from not just the Chamber, but at Labour Party conference, that we believe in Northern Powerhouse Rail and we want to deliver that in full. Geraldine, you were right about the impact that the lack of bus services has in terms of personal safety, but also in terms of the economy. If you cannot get around safely, then that stops you from working in a particular place, or you have to pay for taxis at a much, much higher cost, which also then has an impact on the congestion on our roads, as well as many other things besides. And lastly, with regards to road safety, again, agreed, the Tories got rid of a whole load of targets, but rest assured it's something that we have consistently raised in terms of a front bench. I know my good friend and colleague Jill Furness has been raising that. Prior to that, by the way, we led a concerted campaign, for example, on smart motorways. We were challenging the government again and again about the road safety implications, about the fatalities around that, how are we going to ensure that the bays are at a reduced interval rather than after every mile and a half, as was the case under the government's plan. So we were trying to push them that, look, we all want individuals to be able to travel on the roads, but they need to be able to do so safely. So there has been a constant theme, but unfortunately the key agenda items for us definitely have been about the public transport realm in terms of rail and buses and so forth. It's just consumed so much airtime, especially when the government has been gunning for strikes with regards to our rail workers, our public workers. Instead of paying people a decent wage, we've got them taking the public into a very different avenue, which has meant that rather than talking about whether it's e-scooters or road safety and so on, the most of the bandwidth has been taken up around strikes, around rail, around HS2, the ballooning budget and so on, rather than those bread and butter issues.
Thank you, Tam. I'm going to come to Neil and then Jen to finish. So Neil.
Thanks, James. In relation to Geraldine's point, I don't drive either, and so I get the frustration about failings in public transport as well. And I actually think if more decision makers in Scotland actually had to rely on public transport, that we would see a much better public transport system. And not only that, actually, we see time and time again decision makers, whether it be in the health service or in leisure services, taking decisions to move services to inaccessible areas. I think if people were actually take into account the needs of people who don't drive and rely on public transport, we'd see very different decisions made there. And I think we do need to look at wider, when we are moving, services or building centres and looking at planning to ensure there's absolutely proper transport links in place for people who don't drive and are reliant on public transport. The saying is, build it, they will come. But if there's no public transport links, how are they going to get there? So that very much agree with that point. On road safety, we've got a particular issue in Scotland on the A9 road between Inverness and Perth, where we have tragically seen a real spike in the number of accidents and fatalities on that particular road. Now, the SNP government did promise to upgrade and dual that road by 2025. That's not going to happen. There does need to be investment in the infrastructure to make that particular road safer, but what we've also seen is a couple of issues that have come to light as well is we've seen the number of traffic police officers cut in Scotland quite significantly over the past year or two. Now, we obviously know at a UK level the Tories have cut police officer numbers, so presumably they've also cut the number of traffic cops as well. So I think there's an issue about infrastructure. I think there's an issue about enforcement and safety, and also what we've picked up from is also concerns about actually the level of maintenance done on things like average speed cameras. Are they actually working? Are they actually detecting speeding motorists, and are they keeping everybody safe? So there's a number of issues there that I think we'll certainly be focusing on. I appreciate the point that was being made was more than just one road, but I do think the road safety issue is one that that we want to take forward.
Thank you, Neil. And Jen.
I'm just going to do super quick on the coaches. I think so. London is not the only city that's got problems with where its coach station is. Cardiff, where I used to live, put a temporary coach station in about a decade ago in a dark place with no toilets and no public transport onward access of any kind. You have to get a lift or a taxi to get a coach. Ludicrous. So the trains in London are laid out exactly like you described. The terminals for the trains go in a circle and they go, you go from the direction where you are. The other thing, obviously, it would take longer, say, to get to an east, west, north coach station, but it takes so long to get from Victoria to the actual motorway towards your destination. So actually for 15-20 minutes more on a tube, especially if the tube was free with your coach ticket, probably knock an hour off the journey by coach, which would then be a game changer for people in terms of affordability then. So, love that idea. There we go.
No, thank you, Jen. And I think during the rail strikes last summer, I was on my way to Glastonbury and I had to wait. And within the first hour and a half of leaving Victoria Coach Station, I could still see Hyde Park, which is literally out around the corner. And I was actually I got to Oxford at 10 where I was meeting my friends. So yeah, I think Golders Green, I think, is a place where the coaches do stop. So I think potentially I think there's certainly places that, out there in London where we could do that. Look, folks, we've only got sort of 1 or 2 minutes left. I was hoping to squeeze in one more question, but I think if I double check exactly what time it is, by the time I sadly wrap up, but look, I'm so sorry that we can get round to everybody, but it's been a really great discussion. I think quite a lot of agreement amongst our wonderful panel of Jen, Seb, Liz, Tan, and Neil online as well. Just a big round of applause for them for coming out today. Really great discussion, and as I say, I'm a bit of self-confessed transport geek, so a bit of a dream for me. So thank you to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. See you soon.